Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Today, we're going to discuss how to drive the best results and the most value out of your 2018 bid process. We have Daniel Fialos here, and I'm Rachel Dyke. We're both on Flexport's global pricing team responsible for global bids. So to jump into this, there's many paths a company might have followed to arrive at running a formal bid process, but the main goals are typically the same. So before we talk about those, I'll just say there's a number of terms that we can use for a formal bid process. In this discussion, we'll most often use the term RFP, which stands for Request for Proposal or Request for Pricing. But there's other common terms that you or your colleagues might use. Those include RFQ, bid, or tender. And in this context, those all sort of mean the same thing to us. So why would you run an RFP? To summarize, an RFP basically invites providers to compete with each other on the variables that are most important to your business. By asking all competing providers to respond to the same inquiries, you can get this apples to apples comparison of what they offer. So let's just remember those basic premises as we continue to talk about the topic, because it's actually not always as easy of a task as you might think to actually design your RFP to meet these major goals.
Cool. So all RFPs should be driven for value. I mean, that's obvious, right? It's really how you quantify and qualify value that will ultimately impact your decision making in the selection process through RFPs. A lot of the focus when running these RFPs is typically on the base freight rates, right? Which usually makes up a major chunk of your initial and upfront freight costs. However, there should be more focus on the end-to-end costs, right? Consider scenarios where you may incur additional freight costs, such as additional port storage, special handling services like transloading, warehousing, or any fuel fluctuations throughout the course of the contract. Often providers through this process, through the bidding process, will offer pricing with unreliable and low quality services. You might encounter a rate for a fast and direct and weekly or daily services, but when it comes time to actually signing and moving shipments on those rates, you can quickly discover that you signed up for the wrong thing, or you were tricked into signing up for the wrong thing because of the rate that jumped out to you. A lot of forwarders tend to draw out many services that are unreliable in the services offered. So what kind of services are included in the rate? How much allocation is actually covered in the rate offered? These are questions that you should always keep in mind when evaluating a rate. You know, is the service inclusive of a premium and direct service, or is it a transshipped and deferred services? By having providers offer up all this service info tied to the rate in one consolidated view, you can evaluate the different trade-offs between cost and service. Additionally, by crafting the right questions through your RFI, you can tailor your supply chain needs and you can find the right match. So highlighting the service requirements in your RFI, you know exactly what you're signing up for and what will help drive your decision. So through traditional RFPs, the way they're currently set up and managed, it's actually led to another name I've coined for RFPs, which is a race for price and just price, without actually considering all of the very impactful factors along the way. The biggest pitfall in any RFP is falling for the cheapest rate on paper, right? This is no surprise. I mean, given we're in a commoditized industry, a lot of the discussion is and should be around price. However, the issue with only relying on the cheapest rate or the lowest rate that jumps out on a sheet of paper or on an Excel file is that it contains a static number that doesn't always reflect an accurate state of the market, or it doesn't consider all applicable variable services that you may encounter along the way in your supply chain. It might not also factor in all your allocation needs. So because there's a lot of things that happen in the market that are unforeseen, you should always be prepared to analyze for these unforeseen conditions. You know, what if in the situation, how do you pivot your strategy in a situation where the market collapses? How do you prepare your forwarders, and how do you evaluate those proposals for considerations of a spike in the market, like we witnessed this year in the air market? You know, be prepared for more ocean carrier consolidation or worse, carrier bankruptcy. Be prepared for fuel fluctuations and consolidations in the trucking world, which lead to increased rates. Be prepared for restriction capacities on both air and ocean markets. Also, be prepared for your own growth in your own business, and make sure you're working with a partner who will provide a solution to help you through those growing pains. You know, selecting a provider who can offer up premium services and alternative solutions can help accelerate your growth, so you're never facing issues restocking inventory levels or delivering on your orders. A lot of people and a lot of companies have been burned throughout the course of time because of the notion of signing up to a fixed rate will deliver the best solution for you. But often it doesn't encapsulate the actual market conditions. Take, for example, the Hanjin collapse in 2016. I mean, if you weren't prepared for that, or if you didn't select a provider that was going to be a partner in helping you solve for that issue, then you would likely have been burned that year and through those contracts. Take, for example, the LA port strike in 2015. If you didn't have a provider who had alternative solutions to get your cargo to the West Coast or anywhere inland, then you also would have been burned and stuck with low inventory levels or just inventory sitting at sea. So really just be prepared for anything not covered in the rate offerings provided. This includes everything. So as a result, you know, allow your provider to offer multiple services and price offerings to account for all these factors, including your own growth and seasonality across your business. Be willing to accept consultation from your provider's industry experts and have them give you an outlook of the market so you're prepared and have set expectations of what you will encounter in the upcoming year. Be prepared to accept or at least consider other suggested service and price offerings to cover for all these unforeseen market conditions. Put this onus on your provider. They should be the experts on what the market outlook looks like and give you suggestions on how to deal with it based on your supply chain needs. Lastly, space protection is not always called out in the rates being offered in a number of ways. Low rates often only cover one sailing or one service option, reducing the flexibility and space allotment to move your shipments. So when the market is at its lowest point and clients sign up for the bottom of the barrel rates, they will often face issues getting space when the market hits its peaks, because a lot of providers at that point in time during these peaks are focused on loading cargo with higher revenue generation. Make sure your rate or the rate you're receiving through a proposal covers your space needs.
All right. So we've walked through some of the problem statements related to running an RFP. Obviously, we think the goals are really strong goals, but there are some obvious pitfalls here. So we're going to jump a little bit more into how to actually run a process that identifies and signs up for the most valuable solution. I thought Daniel did a great job sort of outlining some of the challenges here, both in terms of what the market can throw at you, but then also what's going to happen in your own business, and partnering with someone obviously who can help you work through both of those dynamics is truly valuable for you. So let's jump into that.
Great. So as Rachel mentioned, now we're going to jump into how to vet for value and not getting sucked into the race for price, right? So before actually kicking off this RFP process, it's important that you actually know your business and know what you need from a provider so you can translate that information into a bid. So to start, it's very important to know your volumes and how they fluctuate throughout the year so you can leverage better rates and the most applicable services that you will require for those fluctuations in your volume. Now, I know some companies struggle to obtain accurate data on this information. So it's very important to highlight here that having access to that data through a platform is key, because then you can use that to provide that information to the forwarders participating in a bid to leverage, again, better rates and the applicable services that you will require for those volumes. Secondly, research and compare online providers before initiating the bid. Know what you're looking for when screening out these providers, and screen out bad fits by checking references and seeing if these providers have net provider scores or NPS scores. Screen your participants, know the freight forwarders, do some research online, and again, check out what their capabilities are, know who you want to invite, and make sure you're getting the right parties involved. Don't just throw a flyer out to anybody to participate. Be very selective and intentional. In the forwarding market, it's a very saturated market in that there's a lot of players, right? So it's very easy to have a willy-nilly, out of the blue forwarder invited to a bid, and they very well can throw any offering at you that may look attractive up front, but there's no service that's actually backing what they're throwing at you in a bid. So researching and screening participants before actually kicking off a bid proposal is key in this process. Look for areas of improvement and focus within your own supply chain. As an example, if you're having issues managing your inventory, then that's something maybe you want to highlight in your proposal and point out as a service requirement. Cool. So once you've highlighted who you want to involve and what you're looking for in a provider and what exactly you need for that provider to do to meet your supply chain needs, the next step is requesting rates. All right. So in order to request rates in a proposal, it is important to have a very concise and complete rate template so that you're not allowing forwarders to hide fees and or terms and conditions. you can uncover all applicable line items that you will come across through constructing a concise and complete rate structure. And this should allow you to match up your invoices with what you receive on a proposal. You should be able to include and call out any additional services that you require and any variable surcharges that will apply for any additional services rendered. This way, so having this rate structure, this complete and concise rate structure, this leads to less confusion as to what you're actually signing up for and what providers are offering. It also allows for more transparency down to a granular level, should you want that, or if you want to see a more general high total overview. As part of the rate template or alongside it, you can clearly define your SLAs or all your service requirements, such as cargo handling requirements, routing and lead time requirements. So again, there's no confusion from providers on the expectations of what the rates and the proposal should deliver.
So to jump in here on the third point, we recommend that you run some scenario analysis. So what does this mean? Basically, this means, we recommend that you draw up a few stress tests that represent potential fluctuations in your business as well as the market outside of your control. So if you don't have these top of mind, these sort of market scenarios, you might even ask your providers or potential providers to talk you through some potential market events that they would prepare for and they would recommend that you prepare for. In terms of understanding potential fluctuations in your own business, obviously nobody knows the business better than you, but I can say a few scenarios that that we'll often talk through with clients include seasonality. So what if the seasonality of your business, either on the demand side or in the supply side, shifts around? Another one might be, if it's your goal to shift from, let's call it air to ocean this year, what if that plan doesn't go, fully according to plan, or goes in some sort of different direction? Making sure that your provider can, again, still be flexible for those scenarios, and that the reasons you're choosing your provider, whether it's price, value, et cetera, all sort of line up under those scenarios. It's not to say that the most stressful scenario will occur, but it's good to at least sort of have those bounds set up for yourself from a visibility standpoint. We think this is really a critical part to understanding the full value of your provider. And again, if this is not something that you typically do, your provider might even be able to sort of help you set this up. And it also, we think, sparks sort of good internal planning conversations.
Cool. So we've touched base on a lot of the quantitative stuff, but let's now touch base on some of the qualitative questions you can and should be asking your forwarders about. So the first thing is pricing terms. Often these terms are hidden away somewhere, and it's important to set them early with your partners and your providers. Ask providers to make rates binding. After the bid selection, make sure that the invoices you're receiving match up with the bid proposal a provider offered up. Read along all the dotted lines and small fine print. You might even want to check out the back of those proposals because they'll hide terms and fees anywhere. Often that's how some providers catch the attentions of clients via the bid. And, as mentioned earlier in this session, the lowest freight base is where a lot of the focus is typically on, and that number sticks out on paper. But behind that number lies in it potentially a stack full of fees and unfavorable terms. So make sure your provider is calling out all the applicable variable charges and pricing terms upon their submission, and force them to honor them unless otherwise agreed upon due to unforeseen events in the market. Capabilities. So numbers say one thing, but actions and tools that accompany them might say a completely different thing. So inquire about what kind of tracking and visibility capabilities do providers have access to, down to the shipment, container, and SKU level. What kind of reporting and data analytics are provided, and can you access directly from the platform? Having access to these dynamic reporting tools enables an improved future RFP process where you're able to provide better data and therefore clear supply chain requirements to all your providers. Consider the ease of using this platform and getting access to any info you're looking for on your business. Ask your forwarders if they have a carbon footprint program and other sustainability initiatives. Does your forwarder have access to premium services? So as an example, in the ocean market, there are a lot of new carrier premium differentiated services like APL's 3 Eagle services that provide flexibility, reliability, and potential cost savings. In the air market, charter space is becoming all that much more important as the market skyrockets and capacity tightens. Ask your forwarder if they can provide innovative and differentiated freight products. Do they have access to transloading, warehousing, container utilization analysis that allows for a mix of FCL and LCL consolidations? Ask your provider, how are they managing your allocations and what systems do they use to reduce risk of rolls? And what sort of contingency plans do they have in place in case of a market shakeup?
Great. So customer service is obviously an important point here. We recommend that you ask for some indication on this from a provider's current clients. Net Promoter Score is a great example. Net Promoter Score essentially tells you, based on sort of systematic surveys, to what extent a customer base would recommend working with this provider. So not every company runs that type of process, and instead not every provider runs that type of process. And as a result, most companies who are running a formal bid or a formal RFP will ask their potential providers to give them references where they can sort of call the client and ask that client a handful of questions about their experience with the provider. I think that also works. One of the reasons why we suggest asking for something like a Net Promoter Score, asking for something similar to that, is because it basically indicates that the company is systematically checking on their client happiness, how they can serve their client better, and then reacting to that. And so I'll call out that it's potentially a red flag if a potential provider isn't able to very quickly respond with a set of references or some sort of internal indicator of their success with their customers. Okay, so to conclude, I'll mention a few summary points on process. We're obviously promoting transparency here. We think transparency going both ways is really a critical part to running a much higher value RFP process that obviously goes from the potential providers over to you as a client. But it also is important if it starts with transparency coming from the client as well, right? What's most important to you, and then being able to sort of communicate feedback to providers on where there are deltas to the requirements for the business. And then, of course, this the theme that we've really been talking about probably most is just being able to compare your service quality, not just your rates. Rates are obviously very important, and that's why we spend a lot of time talking about the structure of the rates to really understand the full cost to your business. So obviously RFPs will always have a rate component, but making sure that you have a formal process for reviewing service quality is also very important. Another example of this, of course, is looking out for transit times, transshipments, et cetera, where it's not just about the cost of the shipment, but also the reliability of sort of when it's going to arrive, et cetera. All right, so listen, we hope the presentation has been helpful. I'll also mention that our Chief Revenue Officer, Ben Braverman, has a great post on a sort of a similar topic on LinkedIn. I believe it's called 4 Tips for Running a Better Freight Forwarding RFP. And that gets into some of the specifics that Daniel and I have been talking about. So definitely check that out. Obviously we're passionate about this topic. We think it is one of the most important ways to drive value in your business as you go about your sort of annual planning cycle. And we look forward to your questions on the topic and continuing the discussion. So let's kick those off.
Okay, so we have a question here. Do you see technology that can or will eventually predict potential scenarios for rates? Rachel, do you want to chime in on this one?
Sure. So I think that there, certainly are some companies and some possibilities here that will allow or rather provide more visibility on potential scenarios for rates are headed. I think, there's a lot of full-on industries dedicated to predicting rates in volatile markets, not just in freight, but all over the world for all kinds of commodities. So I think we should not ever think that someone can fully predict the spot market. However, I can see potentially some clients who have been really focused on long-term fixed rates, instead opting for a more of a floating rate, but one that has full transparency to where the market actually is, to make sure they're always kind of getting the best possible deal. That's a different type of client than the client who wants to sort of lock in their budget for the year. Anything else you would add to that, Daniel?
No, I think you nailed it.
Great.
I think you nailed it. Cool. So second question here, how many freight forwarders should you run in your RFP? What seems to be the average? Good question. So I'd say, once you've gone through your screening process of picking out the forwarders you want to invite, and that meet or can provide services that meet your supply chain needs, it's probably best to narrow down that list to no more than 10 providers. That is really based on our experiences around the average that we see for number of providers involved in an RFP. This way, involving a number like that in this process, you can have multiple rounds to manage this process and weed out those participants until you get down to the select few you want to work with. And it's a good way to give feedback and communicate areas of improvement through the bid process. Cool. Another question here. Are there templates such as in Excel that allow for quick comparison analysis of rates by lane and in aggregate? So yes, if you check out our CFO's Ben Braverman's LinkedIn, there's actually a template that you can download from there that provides this view. It's a template that is very concise in its structure, that allows for transparency, and allows you to compare and analyze the different offerings you're receiving across all providers involved.
And if I could just jump in there, I think that comparison is really important for sort of what I would call your company's base case. And what I was mentioning earlier in the presentation is having sort of a few scenarios that you want to run through all of those options is also, again, I think is also really valuable, so you can understand sort of the bookends of where the year might go. And that's something, if you don't already have that tool internally, that's something that you might be able to work with a provider on on producing, at least sort of talking through the scenarios. And otherwise, ideally, there would be sort of more, let's call it widely available tools to do this. But I think the template that Daniel mentioned is a great way to get the initial rates laid out.
Great. So another question here, how do you define variable charges in the RFP? Is it the same for all forwarders, as some may absorb it at origin or destination? Another great question. So I would define variable charges as any charges that will apply on additional services incurred. So this can apply to many additional services. One that sticks out to me the most and that I've encountered in my experience the most is additional port free time and container storage at container yards. Some forwarders do combine and absorb these variable charges in their main and base freight line items. The problem with that is that at some point there is a breaking point for that forwarder, right? At some point they're going to lose the will to lose money on those variable services incurred. And so it's very treacherous water to tread on when you're coming across those forwarders who build in all these variable charges into their baseline items. So I think it's important for providers to call out any additional services that might be incurred in your supply chain based on your needs. It's important for forwarders to highlight those and call out what the additional costs are going to be for those additional services. Cool. Next question here. As a forwarder, what are the most common issues you experience caused by the client that might delay RFP submissions? Wow, great question. So I'd say the most common theme that we've experienced that have caused delays is just a misconception of the pricing terms that a client may already have and or that might be most optimal for their actual supply chain needs. And so I would say pricing terms, the volumes, knowing the volumes across lanes. As mentioned previously, a lot of clients have difficulty pinpointing and evaluating all their volumes across their book of business or across their business, which makes it difficult to procure from carriers or airlines the space and rates needed to provide clients. Because if there is that confusion there, that can lead to a lot of stress downstream and further along in the contract. Rachel, anything to add there that you've come across as a common issue?
I would just underscore, I think it's full information up front at the start of the bid. I think it's often productive to actually have kind of a quick follow-on conversation with the potential providers after you've released the bid. But the faster those conversations go without kind of back and forth on sort of requests for more information coming from the freight forwarders, the faster you can get responses from freight forwarders. I think the other thing I'll mention is there can sometimes be tricky timing issues. And so the lane for both ocean and for air that is sort of coming up for bid season right now, which is the Trans-Pacific eastbound for ocean and generally kind of Asia to North America for air. can, it's actually possible, whilst it's important to prepare really early, it's actually possible to sort of ask for an annual rate or an extended rate a little bit too early in the market. So timing can be an important thing there. And I think it's almost never too early to start talking to your potential providers about the fit, start trial shipments, really understanding what the company's about. But in terms of locking down a rate, it's hard for your provider to get you the best possible rate prior to the sort of late February, March, April timeframe. So you can keep that in mind when you take the bid to market.
Great points, Rachel. Another question here. How would you suggest to use multiple providers after you find a select few you want to work with? Example, one provider owns a certain region. So there's a number of ways you can really evaluate how many providers you want to work with, and deciding how to split up your business across these providers. This example of one provider owns a certain region is a common way of doing that, and we see it a lot. And it actually makes sense, because then you could put the onus on that one provider for that one region, and you can always fall back on and focus on that provider servicing that region. That's one way of doing it. You also may divide the award or your business among providers by suppliers. You'll find that if you do it that way, it's easier for your suppliers to have that consistency throughout the year with that one provider. So there's no holes in the process in working with your suppliers. We do recommend, though, that when deciding on an award for your business to providers, that you select one forwarder to manage end to end. Having too many players involved in a single shipment leads to more friction, and therefore more cause or more opportunity for failures. So we do encourage clients to look at awarding their business to one forwarder for one particular lane or all of their business. It's just easier to have less parties involved. Cool. Next question here. Any context on optimal numbers of suppliers to award to? Obviously an extreme variable, but just in general, limiting the number of suppliers and parties involved in managing your business allows for a more optimal solution, right? Less friction, less bottlenecks. So there's no concrete answer of the number of providers you should be working with or suppliers you should be working with. It's really dependent on how you look at your business's growth and the areas of improvements you're focused in on, and what you're trying to optimize for. So if you're moving, I don't know, 100,000 TEUs, the number of providers, 100,000 TEUs or 3 million kgs in air freight, the number of providers that you select to move and award your business to, or move your business with, might be completely different than if you're moving 200 TEUs and a couple of tons of air freight a month. So it really depends on how big your business is, how you're looking at your growth, and what your areas of improvements are.
Yeah, and Daniel, I'll also just say, I think, there's sort of a minimum viable scale for your providers and for your suppliers. On the one hand, having multiple providers allows your providers to specialize and really sort of focus on what they're best at. At the same time, there's a minimum viable scale. So if you take the trade lanes we were looking at, or that I was mentioning earlier, you know, probably awarding less than a couple hundred TEUs to each provider starts to get really inefficient, and your provider is not going to be able to have sort of the pricing power and the space protection power that they would otherwise be able to provide you with a larger chunk of the business. And that's generally going to be true across the providers that you look at.
Got one more. Any ideas on tech involved in performing the RFP? Rachel, do you want to take this one?
Sure. I think there's two questions here. One is what can a company do to sort of better manage their RFP submissions for multiple providers? There's also this question out there of how does a provider manage all the RFPs that they're tackling during a season. I'm going to focus on the first one, assuming that that's the one of most interest. So I think in that case, you know, there's a few types of sort of technology out there that basically allow you to provide this standardized template through an online submission of your provider's potential RFPs, if you will. I'll just be very candid about those. I think on the one hand, they are, you know, they align with a number of the value propositions that we've been talking about. On the other hand, I think a lot of those that are currently in the market really only gun for price, right? And that's where you get the race for price, because what software has done to date is it's focused on the quantitative parts rather than some of the more qualitative parts. So on the one hand, again, some of this software does allow you to standardize people's submissions and then review those submissions on like an internet platform, which is nice. But I honestly don't know of any solutions out there that really allow you to look into the qualitative parts as well. And because of that, I think, you know, if you're going to pursue one of those technologies, you should just make sure that you're running an additional process or that you're talking to that software provider about how you can include that in the process, because most of those were designed to just help you sort for price, pick the lowest one, and that's it.
Great points, Rachel. And if I could just add to that, a lot of those companies that already exist that manage RFPs through tech or through an online platform are incentivized by the cost savings they provide only in the proposal. They're not incentivized by the cost savings that are provided throughout the course of a contract. So that's also a very common pitfall, is having these third parties run a platform or run a bid on a platform that, again, is just a race for price because of what they're incentivized, because of what those companies running those bids are incentivized with. So question here, bidding, is there any bidding software to capture rates? Is this possible? Yes, as Rachel mentioned, there are a number of platform solutions to handle bids, but there are a lot of common pitfalls when running your bid process through those. And you should be running in parallel with that process a qualitative process to evaluate all your providers. So it's not just an evaluation of rates, but also an evaluation of services.
Yeah, and then and I'll say also, you know, it's not a glamorous technology, but if you are using spreadsheets, if you're using Excel, at least having that sort of standardized format and putting it into a nicely structured data format where you can essentially create a mini database of all of your submissions that you can then sort for review or use or feed straight into an analysis. we think is hugely helpful for this bid process. Any of us who have spent a lot of time in analytics, in data structuring, in unstructured data sorting, that the more structured you can get the data, the better. And to be a little more explicit there, we actually also have sort of a rate template that we'll often send to clients as just an example format that allows you to do that, where you can basically understand all of the charges on a per lane basis for all equipment types, et cetera. And if you can sort of get everyone's submissions into that nice format, then feeding that directly into an internal analytics model and evaluation process will save you hours and hours and hours during the process and help you focus more on the value. I think one of the common pitfalls we've seen for those who don't go for the sort of software platform to evaluate it is they request information or rates in a format that doesn't lend itself to easy visualization across bids or easy analytics across bids. So, we're always happy to consult more on that and what that sort of improved data structure looks like. Again, it's going to save you a ton of time and help you focus more on value.
Cool. So I think that's it here for questions. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us and listen to our approach for handling RFPs. Again, please feel free to check out Ben Braverman's LinkedIn post on the 4 tips of running a better RFP process, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks everyone for joining.